Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Maddie Reardon. I'm the Community Engagement and Outreach Manager for 88.9 Radio Milwaukee. For those of you joining us today who are not familiar with Radio Milwaukee, we are a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station with the mission of creating a more inclusive and engaged Milwaukee through music and stories. During this pandemic, we've been able to expand our reach and to host guests from all over the world, which is very exciting. In addition to our wonderful Radio Milwaukee members, we have a couple of additional supporters without whom programming and conversations like this around our podcast by every measure would not be possible. So I'd like to thank the Brico Fund, the Argosy Foundation, and the Zilber Family Foundation. Our By Every Measure Ask the Experts series is just one tactic that we're using to get people talking about systemic racism and how we as individuals and organizations can use our collective power to dismantle some of these systems and to educate our networks on these topics. This particular series, Ask the Experts, will happen for the next 4 weeks, every Thursday at the same time, but we've also created an opportunity for smaller conversations to happen. Our By Every Measure conversation clubs. These conversation clubs are a 6-week commitment for an hour designed to take a deep dive into each of our episodes in our podcast By Every Measure with the same group of individuals so we can build rapport and trust with one another and have open and honest conversations. Our next round of conversation clubs will start the week of February 15th. Wednesdays from 4 to 5 p.m. or Thursdays from noon to 1. You can find more information about these conversation clubs and how to secure your spot at radiomilwaukee.org or by reaching out to me directly, and you'll see my email address pop up on the bottom banner in just a little bit. Right now, I'm going to hand this conversation over to our membership manager, Lily Grant.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here today. We are so excited to embark on this conversation series with you. So as Maddie mentioned, I am the membership manager, and we are a nonprofit organization. And the main reason that we're able to get very creative in using music and stories to find ways to make a better and more inclusive Milwaukee is because we're independent, meaning we are mostly supported by the community. And that's what allows a little music station to really embrace having conversations that help the community see each other, respect each other, and come together, and to work on anti-racism in Milwaukee. So if you're interested in this part of our work, I hope you will consider supporting it. You can find more about membership at radiomilwaukee.org/donate, or just go to our homepage and click the orange heart. And any donation makes you a member for a year, meaning you will be supporting these events and you'll get invited to get to know us better and to get involved in all of the work that we do. So if you have any questions, also, you can always contact me. My information is on the website as well. So that's it for me. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Lily. And with that, let's get to the reason why you are all tuning in. By Every Measure, Ask the Experts in Criminal Justice and Policing with Radio Milwaukee's Tarik Moody and the Sentencing Project's Nazgol Ghandnoosh.
Again, my name is Tarik Moody here from 88.9 Radio Milwaukee, co-host of By Every Measure, podcast on systemic racism with our co-host Reggie Jackson. Today, as Maddie said, this is our kind of a special kind of series we're doing that Maddie's organized called Ask the Experts, where we go deeper in the individual systems that deals with systemic racism. Again, today is criminal justice and policing. And our guest, Nazgol Ghandnoosh, is a senior research analyst with the Sentencing Project. She conducts and synthesizes research on criminal justice policies. She has written about racial disparities in the justice system, public opinion about punishment, and the scope of reform efforts. Her report, Delaying a Second Change, The Declining Prospects for Parole on Life Sentences, examines how states and the federal government have increased prison terms for people with parole-eligible life sentences. She regularly presents to academic, practitioner, and general audiences, and her work has been featured in the Washington Post, New York Times, and WNYC's On the Media. She's also edits the Sentencing Project's Race and Justice newsletter. Please welcome Nazgol Ghandnoosh.
Thank you so much, Tarik. I'm so happy to be with you all here today.
Thank you. Real quick before again, and talk about what is the Sentencing Project and its mission. What is their goal? I know they've been around a little over 30 years now. So.
That's right. Yeah. So we're an organization based in Washington, D.C., and we do both research and advocacy to support a more fair and effective criminal justice system. And so the effective part is about reducing the number of people that are incarcerated, because we know we don't need this many people in prisons and jails in the United States to have the level of safety that we have or to even achieve more. And the fair part is about tackling racial disparities in particular in the criminal justice system.
Thank you. Like one of the things during the podcast, Reggie Jackson, who's kind of an amazing guy here, local, kind of uses data to explain systemic racism, said something about the system is like people keep saying it's broken. Reggie Jackson said it's not broken. It's working as is intended. For example, I was looking at some of your stats on the Sentencing Project under Wisconsin about imprisonment, which I did. The stats was just interesting. So you break it down by imprisonment by race and ethnicity back in 2014. So white imprisonment rate per 100,000 is only 221. Hispanic Latino imprisonment rate per 100,000 is 563. But black imprisonment rate per 100,000 jumps up to 2,500. And of course, nationwide, there are like 2.2 million people in nation prison and jails. That's a 500% increase over the last 40 years. Can you explain how do we get here? And people say, politicians say crime rate went up, so this is what we're doing. We're like, taking a hard stance on crime. But can you really explain how do we get to this 500% increase of imprisonment over 40 years?
Sure. So what happened in the United States is that crime rates were going up in the 1970s, 80s, and until the mid-90s. And since then, the crime rate has fallen to about half the level that it had been in the 1990s. So that's one thing that a lot of people don't realize, that compared to the high crime era that we had in the 1990s, we're much safer then. We still have a long way to go, but we've come a long way. But during that time, in response to that uptick in crime, there were a lot of efforts to basically get tough on crime, which didn't mean being smart on crime. It just meant posturing as if implementing mandatory sentences, sending a lot of people to prison for drug offenses, suggesting that those kinds of policies would help to bring down the crime rate. And at the same time that crime rates were going up in the 1970s, it's important to realize that that was also part of the era of the civil rights movement. And so at the same time that there was concern about an uptick in crime rates, there was also a backlash, similar to kind of backlash that we're seeing now, a backlash to some of the gains of the civil rights movement. And so as a result of that, we had policies that dramatically increased the likelihood of going to prison and the prison terms that people would serve. And it was disproportionately people of color, and in particular, African-American men, that were impacted by these policies. So when you look nationwide now at this point, African Americans are imprisoned at 5 times the rate of whites. And when you look nationwide, but when you look at Wisconsin in particular, that disparity is 10 times. African Americans in Wisconsin are imprisoned at 10 times the rate of whites. So far above the national average.
And why, I was reading your paper, your 2015 paper titled Eliminating Racial Equity in the Criminal Justice System. You state that the criminal justice system's high volume of contact with people of color is a major cause of African Americans, disproportionate rate of fatal police encounters, as well as a broader perception of injustice in many communities. Is that one of the reasons why Wisconsin's high? Mm-hmm. And can you go deeper? Like you talk about, there's 4 key features of that paper that explains this. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So I would say that a lot of people, when they try to figure out why is there so much racial disparity in the criminal justice system, they tend to go to one end or another end of a sort of spectrum of explanations. Some people will look at crime rates and say, well, it's because African Americans have a higher crime rate. Well, that's true and false. That's true if you're looking at the most serious violent crimes, then you see a higher homicide rate for African Americans, and homicide is generally an intraracial crime, which means there's a higher rate of homicide offending among African Americans. That has everything to do with the history of racism in our country and the kinds of geographic layout that you see now in our society, where African Americans disproportionately live in concentrated urban poverty. If you completely flip the script in our society and you had white Americans with a much lower level of wealth, disproportionately living in city centers and poor, and you had the prevalence of guns that we have, then you would have a higher rate of white homicide offending. But that's not the case. So to, I think, tackle that issue, we need to look at solutions beyond the criminal justice system. We need to look at issues like residential segregation. We need to look at educational opportunities. Those are the things that we need to tackle, and job opportunities. But when you look at other kinds of lower level offenses, property crimes, especially if you look at drug crimes, then what you see is that there isn't any difference in the rate of engagement in the criminal activity, especially with drug crimes. Surveys show that people use drugs at similar rates and that they generally buy drugs from other people that are the same race or ethnicity as them. So when you look at crimes like that, then what you see is that it's our criminal justice system that's producing disparities in the way it treats people differently who are doing similar things. So in that report, what I try to do is articulate what are the factors within the criminal justice system. How can we be as clear as possible about how the criminal justice system is driving disparities? And so I identify these 4 factors. One of them is bias in the use of discretion. This is what people generally think about first, I think, like racial profiling by police officers, right? And there's definitely evidence that police officers pull African American drivers over more often for investigatory reasons. So not because they ran a light or are speeding, but because they didn't signal when changing lanes, or just for no reason, just to investigate, just to have a chance to ask them to search their cars. So that's one factor, discretion, not just among police officers, but also prosecutors, judges, parole officers. And then the second factor is policies that have a disparate impact. So for example, drug-free school zone laws that make it so that you have a higher penalty if you sell drugs near a school zone. Well, how that plays out is that if you're in an urban area, you're more likely to get that sentencing penalty than if you're in a rural or suburban area. And so we know who tends to live in urban areas and who tends to live in suburban and rural areas. That kind of policy disadvantages people of color. And then the third and fourth reasons have to do with economics. So the fact that we require a lot of people to rely on indigent defense because people coming into the system are poor, and yet we underfund indigent defense so that defense attorneys push people to take plea bargains in order to settle their cases, or that we require people to post bond to be released pre-trial, and a lot of poor people can't. And African Americans are disproportionately poor and are disadvantaged by that policy. And then the fourth factor is the fact that, as one of my colleagues once put it, once we're done punishing people, they're actually not done being punished. You can be done with your prison or probation or parole term, but your criminal record is going to haunt you for the rest of your life. It's going to affect your chances of getting employment, housing, financial assistance if you're applying to college. And so that's a way that we make it so that disproportionately low-income people of color come into the system, and they're made even poorer as a result of their contact with the system.
And let's talk about the first one, about the bias, racial bias. Like, I was listening to the WYC episode on the media where you were talking about the racial bias in the media. Does that, how police treat African Americans by pullover, is there a correlation from that because of what the media does?
Definitely. You know, I think that if we're truthful, we would all acknowledge that in whatever field you work in, your work is impacted by biases that you have. And a lot of those biases are impacted by television shows, by news coverage. What kind of crimes do you see when you watch television? And there's some great media studies that show that the kinds of crimes that are shown on TV are disproportionately ones that are committed by African Americans against against whites. That's not the most common kind of crime. It's not the least common kind of crime. So it's not like the selection is let's find the weirdest case or let's find the most common case. Why is it that those crimes are disproportionately featured? And as a result of that kind of news coverage, white Americans disproportionately fear being victims of crime committed by African Americans, and they end up underestimating how often African Americans themselves are victims of crime. If you think about our criminal justice system and its attempt to try to tackle issues of crime in our society, it's disproportionately people of color that are impacted by crime, that are crime victims, much more than white Americans. If you ask people of color, what would you like to have happen to tackle the crime rates that you're dealing with in your communities? A lot of people will say, I want to make sure people go to prison. I want to make sure that they're accountable. But they'll also say, I want investments in my community to prevent these crimes from happening in the first place. And that part of what they ask for is often ignored. And that second part of, well, I want to hold people accountable, that gets delivered by our criminal justice system right now as it is.
That's kind of funny. I was thinking, I don't know if you saw the Saturday Night Live skit that became really famous where there were news reporters, 2 black reporters and the 2 white reporters reporting crime, and they were trying to get points to guess which race it is.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that one? You remember that one?
It's familiar, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So basically they're sitting there like report the crime, and they like the black man and they go woo, or the white person, like it's a white person, another team, they score points. And I remember growing up as a kid, my parents would do that. They're like, you hear them like, I hope this person is not black doing this, because
right.
There's a thing. What happens when a white person quits crime? That person is judged as an individual by society. When a black person commits a crime, it's kind of lumped in as a group.
Right.
And I feel like the racial bias plays a lot in the role of our political policies, because that's what, people see that, and then a candidate runs on what they see on media. And like, I think the racial bias in media really plays a role in how our policies are made. Do you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, when you look at, the point of these, I think that the point of these accounts about racial bias, the first one that I want to make is the idea of, is that they try to convey the idea of implicit bias, right? It's not the case that a lot of people that are producing this TV material or news coverage are overtly racist. Most of them, if you survey them and you ask them questions, they would say, I support the goal of racial equality. I don't want to create work that's biased. That's the case if you ask people across a lot of different fields, healthcare, education. But because we're so saturated with these images, because we grow up in the society that we grow up in, we have implicit bias that affects a lot of our decision making. And unless there's monitoring and accountability of our work, that bias kind of slips through. So when it comes to media coverage, reporters would need to check how often are they featuring which kinds of stories. And so not only is the bias important, but also I think the context is important. So for example, I mentioned to you that crime rates have fallen to about half their level in the 1990s. But when Gallup surveys people and asks them, do you feel safer now than last year? The majority of Americans still say they feel less safe. They feel that crime is getting worse in our society. So there's a disconnect between what's actually happening and what people understand. And that has a lot to do with the way that crimes are presented in the news without the context that there's this terrible thing that's happened. But look, crime rates have fallen. We're at a historically low level of crime right now. And that kind of news coverage makes it so that elected officials are very reluctant to implement smart criminal justice policies. So, for example, we know that people who serve very long sentences are very safe to be released from prison, especially including people who were convicted of very serious violent crimes. They have some of the lowest recidivism rates when they're released. But when those releases happen, sometimes there's a lot of negative news coverage focusing on the original crime of the person that got released. Or in general, whenever there's any policy to scale back the punitiveness of our system, there will be coverage of the 1 or 2 cases where someone gets in trouble again. And so elected officials respond to that thinking, well, I don't want that kind of coverage, so I better not make the necessary corrections that I should be making to our justice policies.
And I don't know if you know this answer. Like, are there? I know that you try to work with organizations and politicians on trying to change this. Have you worked with media organizations? Any case studies of media organizations trying to take some of what you've written and some of the advice that you put out on their coverage? Are there any outlets out there trying to change how they cover, especially TV outlets?
Oh, well, I'm not sure about how much this kind of feedback has been absorbed into TV coverage, but I know that in print media, there's a lot more receptiveness now to this kind of critique. And there are a lot of reporters that bring this kind of information to their editors, and there are outlets that are specifically designed to provide a more complete picture of our criminal justice system. So for example, the Marshall Project puts out its own publications and sometimes places in other major print media outlets. There's an organization called The Appeal, and they present a lot of coverage also on the problems of our criminal justice system, as well as highlighting reform efforts around the country.
I wanted to talk about, I was also heard the term, when we go back to policing, I think it was in the On the Media episode, or a term called data-driven policing. Can you elaborate on what that means?
Right. So the idea with data-driven policing is, as I understand it, and I'm not, my expertise is more in the prison and jail end of things rather than policing. But from what I understand, it's about using data on crime rates to figure out where police should go and focus their efforts. So rather than just the hunch of officers or lieutenants, it's actually, looking at neighborhood crime rates to figure out where to go and who to target for police enforcement efforts. The trouble with this kind of policing is that, as with any kind of data-driven criminal justice policy, is that the data is driven by the criminal justice system itself. So, when you look at, does that include looking at where drug arrests are happening? Well, that's very much a discretionary decision on the part of police departments about where to go and target enforcement efforts. Typically, that means not college campuses, but lower income communities of color. If the data is looking at more serious violent crimes, like even at where homicides happen, well, that does make sense to target police enforcement to those communities. But what about all the people who live there that are not engaged in criminal activity? What is the fair and legally upholdable way that we should be able to, that police should be interacting with those populations? One of the challenges that police have is, when you look at homicides, it's about nearly a third of homicides are not cleared, meaning that police officers do not arrest someone that's accused of homicide, that they're not able to find a suspect in a third of cases. That's a really high proportion. And one of the things that drives that high proportion is the tattered relationship that they have with people in the communities. And that has to do partly with the fact that police will target high crime neighborhoods or people that they think come from high crime neighborhoods for other kinds of enforcement. And then those populations don't want to be supportive when it comes time to investigate a very serious crime, because they've had such a bad interaction in the past with police officers.
Let's go back to the paper. So you highlighted some of the 4 key features, but you also highlight some best practices to address this, how to change this. Part of our podcast, By Every Measure, we want to talk about the history and the problems, but we also want to talk about how can these problems be solved and fixed. Can you talk about some of the best practices that you mentioned in your research?
Sure. So on the first one, tackling racial bias in the discretionary decisions of criminal justice practitioners, there's a number of training programs now that are in place. But I think the kinds of promising reforms that we see are ones that try to create a system of monitoring and accountability. So for example, actually in Milwaukee's prosecutor's office, they did this a couple years back with drug paraphernalia charges. They noticed that prosecutors were disproportionately bringing drug paraphernalia charges against African Americans rather than against white defendants. And so they created a system to keep track of that and give feedback to prosecutors about how often they were bringing those charges. So that's only on that particular charge that progress was made. But that kind of system of reviewing and giving feedback and making criminal justice actors more accountable for their decisions is what's needed. In terms of tackling racial disparities that are part of laws or policies rather than the decisions of individual actors. I mentioned drug-free school zones and the fact that they have a disparate impact on people of color. A number of jurisdictions, for example, Indiana, have scaled back their drug-free school zones. So from within 1,000 feet of schools and other kinds of centers like community centers to 500 feet, and added a requirement that the person selling drugs should be able to reasonably expect that there would be kids around at that time. So, for example, if someone's selling drugs on a Sunday in that perimeter, then that wouldn't count and they wouldn't get the sentencing enhancement. So that's another example. Tackling the financial issues. So you know what, I forgot to ask Maddie to show the slide about this. So let me see if I have something useful. I have let's see. I forgot that I shared some slides with Maddie earlier, but okay, I'll try to remember this going forward, actually. So tackling the economic disadvantage that African Americans face. So they're getting rid of cash bail. A number of jurisdictions have gotten rid of cash bail requirements and have to work hard to figure out what kind of way they will assess risk of flight or crime for people that they decide to hold. But deciding to move away from a cash bail model is really important there.
Can we talk about the cash bail? Because I know I'm originally from Atlanta, and I know Atlanta a few years ago got rid of cash bail. So talk to me exactly. Some people might not know what cash bail is. Explain what cash bail is and why eliminating cash bail was so important. Like the mayor was very proud of eliminating cash bail. Like they were just really, became a huge story. So why is that such an important thing in dealing with these issues?
Sure. So most people in jails in the prisons are places where people typically serve sentences of more than a year. Jails are places where people serve sentences generally shorter than a year, but also the majority of people in jails are held pre-trial. So they're innocent, they're trying to work out their case. And most often that means they're waiting to accept a plea bargain where they plead guilty to the charge that they're facing, and they either get time served or that they then get some prison or jail sentence, right? So most people in jail are pre-trial or pre-conviction. So what happens is in jurisdictions where there's cash bail, then a judge says, well, you were picked up you were arrested for stealing something from someone, and I want you to post a couple $1,000 bail in order to be released and work out your case. So for example, this was the experience of Khalif Browder in New York City, which was a very high profile case. That couple $1,000 was something that his family could not afford. As a result of that, he was held pre-trial. His case ended up dragging quite a bit of time, and so he was held for 3 years before any kind of conviction. And then finally, his case was dismissed. So during that time, had his family been able to post bail, he would have been released. He wouldn't have been held in jail where he was abused by other people that were incarcerated. It exacerbated his mental health issues, and he ended up killing himself after his release. So that's an extreme case in terms of the outcome of pretrial detention that's based on someone's poverty, someone's inability to post bail. And so what happens more generally is that when people are required to post bail in order to be released, white Americans, who generally have higher assets in our country than African Americans, are more readily able to do that. And they can get released pre-trial while they work out their case. Now, African Americans disproportionately are unable to post bail, and they're held pre-trial. And when people are held pre-trial as they work out their case, they're more likely to accept worse plea offers. A plea offer that says, let's keep you in prison for another year and then you can be released. Whereas had they been released, they would have said, I don't accept that offer and I'm waiting for the investigator to come up with, their report and then let's see what happens. And then they may get dismissed, their case may get dismissed completely with no prison time. So that's why cash bail is so important, that it disproportionately holds disproportionately poor people of color behind bars and incentivizes them to take worse plea offers.
And then I want to go back to the other measures, but I feel like, I don't know if I think Wisconsin still has a cash bail. I'm not sure, but I feel like there's people fighting that because it's a business, right? It's like there's a lobby, like there's an industry around this, correct?
That's right. So there are bail bondsmen that profit off of the interest that people have to pay, which are exceptionally high usually. So people will end up taking loans to be able to post bail, and they have to pay exuberant fees in order to repay those loans. And so there is an industry that lobbies against these kinds of reforms.
Let's go back to, sorry to interrupt you when you were talking about your measures. Talk about the additional suggestions you think for reform.
Sure. So the last one that I mentioned, that I was thinking of, is policies that disadvantage people for life as a result of their criminal histories, right? And so here is where ban the box reforms are important to make it so that when employers ask people about their criminal history, that they have first had a chance to get to know the person. Because what happens is when you apply for a job, there is a box at the top of a lot of job applications that ask if you have a felony conviction. Sometimes it asks if you've ever been arrested and so on. And when you check that off saying yes, a lot of times people will describe how they just watch the person at the job that they're applying for just throw out their application in the garbage without looking at the rest of it, right? And so given that we know about the disparities in the criminal justice system, that means that African Americans especially are disadvantaged when applying for jobs with a criminal history. And so ban the box reforms try to say, well, in the initial application, let's remove that question, ask that question later on, once you've had a chance to get to know the candidate, and then maybe you're more willing to listen to their account of what happened, how they picked up that charge and conviction.
I got a question here from Brian. Is bail adjusted to your known income?
I think that it depends. In some places it is to some extent. In some places it depends on what the charge is that you're accused of. And so instead of making it so that instead of just saying we're going to hold you because we think you're not safe to be released, based on the severity of the charge, you'll get a higher bail amount. But if you're wealthy, you can post that bail amount and be released. And let me just also add one thing here that just to make this conversation a little bit more current, and with respect to the pandemic that we're in. And during this time, it's especially important to really think critically about all these issues of why are we holding people pre-trial? If we're holding them because they can't pay and they're not a real community safety risk, if they're not a risk of flight, then we're exposing them to a potentially deadly virus in jails. Why are we holding people in prison for such long sentences when they're no longer a safety risk? Especially if they're elderly, we're exposing them to a very dangerous virus in these prisons and jails that have shown that they're unable to effectively contain this virus.
And I want to get to one of your slides about the decarceration rates, but I have a personal question. I noticed in the last election, muni elections, especially in Wisconsin, district attorneys have a lot of power to make some of these reforms. Am I right?
100%. Mm-hmm.
But they don't seem to do that. But also during election, I noticed a lot. I don't know if this is nationwide, but a lot of district attorney races run opposed.
Right.
Do you understand why that is? It's like this, like I hear a lot about the district attorneys has a lot of power to make these reforms change, but they don't, but no one runs against them.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's starting to change now in the last couple of years, where there are even some people that have worked as defense attorneys running as district attorneys, and so that's the case, for example, in Philadelphia with Larry Krasner. In Los Angeles, George Gascon is a district attorney who has very big ideas about reforms, including a proposal that he made on his first day in the office, saying that people who have served 15 years in prison, they should all be reevaluated to see if they should still be incarcerated or not. And that's exactly the kind of reform that we need to see from district attorneys, tackling issues like, why are we bringing people into jail or prison for marijuana, tackling nonviolent drug offenses and how long people are incarcerated for those, but also taking a second look at sentences for very serious crimes. Because as we emphasize at the Sentencing Project, half of people in prison in the United States are serving time for a violent crime. So that's crimes like assault, robbery, and more serious crimes like rape and murder. And if we want to end mass incarceration, we have to realize that we've dramatically increased prison terms for these crimes, and we have to scale them back. We're holding people in prison when they're not a safety risk anymore, and we're wasting our limited public safety resources to incarcerating geriatric people in prisons instead of investing in what we know would be more effective to tackling the crime rate and making it even lower. So for example, in Milwaukee, there's a documentary called Milwaukee 53206 that came out a couple years ago, and it featured the story of Baron Walker, who had a sentence of 60 years, and as a result of some prosecutorial decisions there, he's been able to be released. The prosecutor in Milwaukee suggested to the courts that they reconsider his sentence, and he was able to have that reduced. And so that's the kind of thing that we need to see from a lot more prosecutors. And when people think about the criminal justice system and mass incarceration and think, how can I get involved? Well, pay attention to prosecutors' races. Don't just pay attention to this issue when we have presidential elections. Pay attention to these local races, because they really matter in terms of shaping who's in prison and for how long in your community.
And that applies to like the district attorney when they run unopposed. Like someone asked a question, like, do you have to be a lawyer to run for district attorney? Is that a thing?
I think typically people are lawyers, but there is increasingly, people that have civil rights backgrounds, have worked as defense attorneys. So you don't have to have experience exclusively or only as a prosecutor. But I think I think you're definitely assisted with the legal training, legal background.
Okay. You had a slide. I don't know if Maddie can put it up, but there's a decarceration rate leaders, and there's the people like leading the pack as far as getting rid of people in prison. New Jersey leads the pack. Why is New Jersey up there? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up the slides. I got so excited to talk to you, I forgot all about the slides. So New Jersey is a leader, and so are states like Connecticut, New York. I skipped over Alaska there because they have implemented some changes to basically try to undo that leadership status that they have right now. But some of the ways that these states have been able to reduce their prison populations so dramatically, and I should note that during the time they've reduced their prison populations, their crime drop has fallen as much and sometimes more than the nationwide crime drop. But they've done things like scale back sentences for drug offenses, increase parole grant rates. That was an issue in New Jersey. So, reduce admissions, reduce sentence lengths, and increase ways that people can be released earlier. So those are some of the ways that they've been able to do it.
And let's talk about the term that became a third rail in the election, defund the police. Like, we talk about that means, it was literally political suicide, I guess they called it. But it's more complicated than that, right? Like, can you explain what people mean by defund the police? I think people really don't understand that. People get scared, like when you say defund the police.
Well, I can explain what it means to me. And I think for me, when I hear it and when I have read and heard about articulations of what it means, there's a lot of overlap between the argument of defunding the police and the idea of justice reinvestment. Justice reinvestment is this idea that was articulated by Susan Tucker and Eric Cadora, and they wrote a paper about it a couple of years back. And the idea with justice reinvestment is, let's scale back incarceration and use the savings from that to invest more effectively in tackling crime, to invest effectively in treating substance use problems. So we know, for example, that a lot of people that go into prison who've committed crimes, they do it because of a substance use problem. They committed their crime under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or they committed their crime because they needed the money to maintain a substance use problem. And yet we know that a lot of people in our country are still uninsured. If they're insured, they can't get access to drug treatment. And so this seems like the most obvious thing to fix if you want to reduce admission to prison and if you want to tackle the crimes related to substance use problems. So why don't we think about, instead of keep sending so many people to prison and keeping them for so long, dedicating resources to tackling that? And so I think Defund the Police has a similar kind of idea in mind about policing. So when we think about some of the things that police officers do, and these are some of the things that chiefs, smart urban chiefs, will point out, these are not things that police officers should be engaged in. Police officers should not be doing mental health calls. We should have an unarmed part of our government that goes and helps people that are suffering from mental health crises. And increasingly, we see some jurisdictions beginning to implement those policies. Related to this, traffic stops, a lot of traffic stops, you don't need an armed police officer to go and give someone a ticket for what they did. And so there's movements around the country now to remove traffic enforcement from policing. And so let's really think about, when we think about crime, let's not just think about, once it's happened, sending police officers there. Let's think about what's actually driving it. If it was happening in our own community, and especially this, I'm sort of directing this to the white audience members. If you had these problems happening in your community, what would you want to have happen? Would you want to have police officers come and arrest a lot of people? Do you think that would really solve it? Or would you be looking for getting a solution that gets to the roots of the problem? So I think that's what, to me, the idea of defunding the police and justice reinvestment is about.
Okay. We got another question here from Brian. It's kind of an interesting question. Like, as you know, a lot of states are basically not only decriminalizing marijuana, but they're also legalizing marijuana. Have you seen any data or impact of the legalization of marijuana on decarceration rates around the country, like states like Illinois, California? Have you, as the Sentencing Project or yourself, looking at the effects of the legalization of marijuana, not just the decriminalization?
That's a great question. Okay, so now I'm going to ask Maddie to show us slide 2 that I have, and I think I can try to address this and explain this question. So let me explain this, what's shown in this graph, and then I'm going to answer Brian's question. So this is a graph that shows the overall prison population by the conviction offense. And what you can see is that the highest line is the number of people in prison with a violent conviction. And when you look at the number there, there's only been a 2% reduction in that population between 2009 and 2017. When you look at drug offenses and property crimes, those are the lines below, and you can see more substantial decarceration there, and especially for drug offenses. But you can see that those lines are overall much lower than for the violent crime rate, right? And so what that's showing you, again, is what I was trying to say before, which is that the majority of people, half the prison population is there for a violent offense, and it's about 18% of the prison population that's there for a drug offense. So when we think about marijuana reform, it's a really important area. And thanks, Maddie, I'm done with this chart. So it's a really important area for policymakers to sort of get their feet wet with criminal justice reform and really begin to think about these issues. But so far, we don't see it translating very much to decarceration overall, because there are not a lot of people in prison with a marijuana conviction as their most serious offense. What does happen is a lot of people who, let's say, are on probation or parole for some other kind of offense, and if they're caught with marijuana in their system, or if they're caught with marijuana in their possession, they will be revoked from parole and probation and sent to prison. And unfortunately, in a lot of states that have legalized marijuana for recreational use, they haven't tackled that problem. Like in Pennsylvania, if marijuana is legalized for recreational use, but if you have it on your possession or in your system, you'll still go to prison. So it's sort of we have two legal systems in place for most people in our country, and then for people that are under some kind of criminal justice supervision, they have a different set of rules that they have to live by.
You mentioned as a citizen, like if we want to make more of an impact to change these policies and make better reform, how as a citizen, besides some of the stuff you mentioned about like looking at down ballots, who's running as prosecutor, district attorney, what else can we do in our communities to help make an impact and change how our criminal justice system treats people?
Yeah, so I think one thing that you can do is look beyond politics. So look at your workplace, for example, and see what's the hiring policy. Is that box on job applications at your workplace asking about if people have a criminal record? Can you talk to your manager about changing the job application, or organize colleagues to do that so that people can get a leg in a foot in the door at your organization if they have a criminal record? What about where you went to college? Ask look into your alma mater and what their admissions policy is for people with criminal histories, and see if you can get that changed. So look at your school, where your children go to school, and ask for information about discipline and racial disparities in discipline at your child's school, and ask these questions and make requests that they be fixed. If students of color are being disproportionately disciplined, ask for that to be addressed and encourage other people and your other parents to do the same thing. And then I also want to say, educate those around you. Have these difficult conversations with people in your family and in your network who don't know about these issues, and really educate them and get them up to speed. And importantly, let me bring up one more slide I have here. This is slide 3. So I want to show you this image of these are a group of people that were released as a result of a court case in Maryland. It was called Unger versus Maryland. It was in 2012. And this case decided that when these people originally had their trials, there was misinformation given to the juries. And so they had a chance to be resentenced, and they were released. And there were about 200 people that have been released as a result of that case. Most of these people have serious violent convictions. Most of them have homicide convictions. But if you remember the picture, most are African American, most are elderly. And so really begin to think about and talk to colleagues about, and your family about, this issue of why do we incarcerate people for so long, including for serious crimes, including for violent crimes. Think about how the people that we're talking about are elderly. They're not a community safety risk. And so if we really want to get serious about tackling mass incarceration, we have to get beyond marijuana reforms. We have to get beyond private prison reforms. We have to scale back sentences for violent crimes. And at the Sentencing Project, we have a website that's called endlifeimprisonment.com. And so take a look at that, and you'll learn about our campaign to end life imprisonment and our efforts to encourage policymakers to limit prison terms to 20 years, because 20 years should be enough time to rehabilitate someone. And it's generally enough time for people to age out of criminal activity.
Well, thank you. I got one more question. I guess it deals with the election. Like speaking of the Sentencing Project, there's all this talk about election and voting for felons and your efforts there. Talk about that effort, what the Sentencing Project is trying to do as far as getting formerly incarcerated people actively engaged in the election process and the voting process.
Yeah, so what we do at the Sentencing Project in terms of the big work that we do around elections is to try to enfranchise everybody, to try to make it so that contact with the criminal justice system doesn't mess with your right to vote, and so that voting is not seen as a privilege. So right now, over 5 million Americans can't vote because of a felony conviction, and it really varies by state what the requirements are. Some states, even if you're done with your sentence, you have to get a pardon from the governor in order to get your voting rights reinstated.
It's like Florida. Florida does that.
That's right. Florida does that, and there was a huge ballot initiative there that scaled that back, and the legislator undid a lot of that progress. And so, there's this. It can't but be assumed that the reason that legislators are trying to strip voting rights from people because of their criminal history is because it disproportionately affects voters of color. And so I think that bias in those policies is really important as we think about having fair and free elections. We have to realize that there are a lot of people that are barred. And in many countries, like in Canada, in many European countries, being in prison doesn't bar you from voting. So, and including in some states, like in Maine and Vermont, and recently in Washington, D.C., as a result of a reform here, being in prison doesn't mean that you can't vote. But in a number of jurisdictions around the country, a number of states, even if you're done with your prison sentence and you're on parole and probation, you still can't vote. And so we, really encourage people to get involved in this effort and ask their legislators to support full enfranchisement for people, regardless of their criminal justice history or contact.
Well, thank you so much for this eye-opening data and knowledge, Nazgol, and thank you for your partner for our brand new series, Ask the Experts by Every Measure. Really appreciate taking the time to talk to us about the criminal justice system and what the Sentencing Project is doing to try to change how people are treated in that system. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
I just want to say another huge thank you to Nazgol and Tarik for this extremely important conversation. Thank you so much to everyone who took the time to tune in today. And please remember to join us next week at the same time, same place for our second conversation in By Every Measure, Ask the Experts series, centered around systemic racism in housing with Jenny Schutz from the Brookings Institute. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.